Hello, this is Mary Boo, and I welcome you today to our webinar on effective photo listing and public recruitment, best practices for developing strengths-based narratives. I am with the AdoptUSKids family support team, and I'm joined today by Tracy Serginian, who will be asking questions periodically. Tracy is director of the AdoptUSKids capacity building and engagement team. Let's start today by telling you a little bit about AdoptUSKids. As you may know, AdoptUSKids is a project of the U.S. Children's Bureau, which is operated through a cooperative agreement between the Bureau and the Adoption Exchange Association. Our goal is to raise public awareness about the need for foster adoptive families for children in the public child welfare system, and to help states, territories, and tribes recruit, engage, develop, and support adoptive and foster families. And of course, we operate a national photo listing with more than 5,000 profiles of children waiting to be adopted. We also partner with states, territories, and tribes on photo listing efforts and other recruitment strategies to help ensure children achieve permanency. Today, we're here to talk about a new paradigm of public recruitment for children and teens waiting to be adopted, with a really strong focus on protecting the children's safety, privacy, and dignity. We'll talk a little bit about what that philosophy is like and how you can accomplish that goal. I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference between a public narrative and a private narrative for children waiting to be adopted, and then get into some specific ways how administrators, workers, and others can really make changes to embrace the new paradigm and do their best by children and teens. I'm also going to give you concrete examples of what we could do together to make a difference for children when we're doing public recruitment for them. First, I'll get started talking about the new paradigm. And I want to own, first of all, that this isn't new to everybody. In our field, some people are really already focused on being strengths-based, while others, it's more of a gradual learning process. But we want to call on the entire adoption field to embrace the paradigm, especially related to public narratives of children and youth who need a family. And this paradigm is one that encourages strengths-based narratives with positive, descriptive information and up-to-date, appealing photos. It puts the highest possible priority on children's safety, dignity, and privacy, as I mentioned earlier. And it seeks to encourage parents to learn more about adoption before presenting them with additional information about the challenges and disabilities a particular child may face. And so it's a way of thinking for those prospective parents to share to when they're going to learn more about the children who are waiting to be adopted. And there's a stage of sharing information, public, private, and then later more detailed information as we move forward. And I wanted to start as we talk about this paradigm to say now that this isn't at all about hiding information from parents or keeping parents from understanding how they can best meet children's needs, but it really is about sharing information at the right time in the process. So let's talk about why such a change is needed. Photo listing has been around for decades. And much has changed in the world since it first started. In the beginning, there were public profiles of children in a booklet or a handout in a library, or a packet that was given to parents who are making their way through the adoption process. But of course, since then, we have launched into a digital world where access to information is widespread and prevalent. The internet become commonplace. We've had the federal government pass laws related to privacy, including the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, known as HIPAA, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, known as FERPA. And these are laws that really highlight the need to protect confidential medical and educational information, and in order to keep what is private, private in an all too public sphere. And as the times have changed, jurisdictions have changed policies and practices, but not the entire field. And the whole field does not acknowledge that these substantial changes in how our world operates can and should lead to a change in how we feature children who need a family. And so what we want to talk today is about that change, why this change, what this change looks like, and how jurisdictions can move forward making that change. And we ask you to think about how we can all work together to have the best possible chance to recruit families for children and to protect them in the process. And one of the questions some people ask is why did AdoptUSKids embark on this effort to change the paradigm in the field? And first and foremost, we're uniquely positioned as the entity hosting the largest U.S. photo listing with narratives and profiles from every state. We have a vantage point to see what narratives are like, how children are being featured, and what are the best strategies. So we started from that vantage point, but then we dug deeper and we convened focus groups of adoption professionals, young people who'd been in foster care, and foster adoptive parents. We surveyed and interviewed prospective adoptive parents, frontline caseworkers, and others in child welfare. We reviewed thousands of narratives of waiting children and teens. We had long conversations about what's in narratives, what shouldn't be. We researched jurisdictions' photo listing practices and policies, and we looked at some of those federal laws I talked about related to privacy and data protection. As we went through that process, we came out the other end saying, okay, we really want to do something different. And one of the things that became clear to us is really evident in this continuum of disclosure, that there are different places in the process where information can and should be shared. And again, when we talk about photo listing, we're often talking about a public photo listing or flyers at an event or other information, a newspaper story, a waiting child feature on TV, so information available to anyone in the public. And our goal for this area is really to keep the information positive, strengths-based, focused on the child's talents, their dreams, what they like to do. And our goal is to engage families who might be interested in adopting this child or others, and to make them see the child as a person and as a child first. But then there's another step in the process where we think more information can be shared, and it's what we talk about as a private narrative, where it's for people who have been through the training and they've been through the home study process, and we believe should sign a confidentiality agreement. And there, they really are very serious about adoption, and they need to know more about the children who are available to see if it's a good fit for their family and if they can meet the child's needs. So it's at this second stage where you share more detailed information about potential disabilities, challenges, support needs, other things that help the family know, okay, this is a good fit or it's not, or we may be able to help this child. And then, but there's also a third step, which is for people who are really serious about a particular child, and this is where you would share all of the information. And again, I want to say our goal is always full disclosure, but at the right time in the process. And so we're going to talk a lot today about what's shared publicly, because that's how most public recruitment is done, is in these avenues that are open to the entire community, to the child themselves, their teachers, their peers, and others. So when we think about the public realm, I think the easiest way to understand and embrace this new paradigm that we're talking about with strengths-based positive information is to really put yourself in the place of the child or youth being featured. Thinking about the fact that the public narratives are, in most cases, easily accessible to the young person, their classmates, maybe their birth family members, predators, unfortunately, really to anyone. We've talked to people who've had children call them from the library at school and ask for a change in a narrative because they didn't like the way it was said. We've heard from teens who've had other people see their narrative in a public realm. So it's really to think about, given that this information is out there in the public, how do we present the information that is we do right by children and we protect them? And I think it's really easiest if we think about what we want for ourselves and how we share information in different ways for ourselves. And I think a couple of really good examples are really helpful to crystallize this for me. One is a dating profile. When you first put up a dating profile, you put your best self forward. You talk about what you like to do, what's important to you. And then maybe on your first date or your second date, you say, oh, by the way, I have this quirk. I need to be alone for 2 hours every evening after work, or I get really crabby. And then maybe down the road, you'd share even more details about things that you maybe aren't as proud of about yourself. But you start with this. You start with, this is my best self, what I want somebody to know about me and get to know about me. Another good example of that, I think, is thinking about a resume or applying for a job. In your resume, you put your best foot forward. You talk about what you've accomplished, where you've worked, what your profession is, and then if you get invited to an interview, they're probably going to ask you if you have any weaknesses or areas of growth, and you'll still give a fairly political answer. Maybe I I need to be more focused, and I need help with that. But again, and then down the road when you have the job, you're going to talk to your supervisor about some real challenges. So it's the same. What we should do for children is what we do for ourselves, which is sharing information in stages as we move along in a particular process. And I think it's something that we really owe to the children to do as we recruit for them. So now we've sort of established that baseline. I want to talk a little bit about what goes in that public profile. And as we went through this process, we identified 3 different areas. We have things to include, things not to include, and what should be considered carefully. We called these the green light, yellow light, and red light areas, and that kind of helped us to think, nope, that's a red light, it should never be in. And it's kind of a nice way to think about it. And there are certain things that are always green light items, and they can go in any narrative, and I'll talk more about those. So I'm going to go through each of those areas of what can go in a public narrative. And the first, these are some very simple things. Obviously, the child's preferred first name. So if he goes by Bobby, call him Bobby. Don't call him Robert. Let the child pick how they want to be identified. And because again, that's who they are at their core. Their nickname, if that's what they go by, that's what feels right to them. And of course, we want positive personality traits. You want to know that a child is inquisitive, funny, kind, caring. Think of all of the things that you love about the children in your life, or what makes you smile about a child. Those are the things that you want to put forward in the public narrative. I want to talk about their strengths, the things that they're really good at. If they're really good at getting to school on time, or they're a great listener, or they help with chores, they like to learn about history and culture. Those are strengths that you want to put in the narrative. Obviously, hobbies, interests, pastimes, how they like to spend their time when they're not in school, when they're just having fun. What are the things that really engage them and make them a part of a family and part of our community? Things they like about school. Again, what's their favorite subject? Do they have a teacher that they really look up to? Are they doing well in school? There's some questions like, what makes them laugh? What are the things that really make their day special? Things that are important to them. Again, the key here, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, is details. So if you have a narrative that says he likes sports, well, that's good. It's good to know. But what does he like about sports? Does he like to watch sports, play sports? Is she a soccer player? Does she have a favorite soccer team? It's those details that are going to engage people and really give you a better sense of who the child is as a person. If you say they like to read, which books? Do they have a favorite book? Did they just finish a 12-book series and they're really proud of that? Those are the kind of details that make the public narratives really engaging and really interesting. And I'd say when we talk about hobbies and pastimes, I'd say watch out for things that you could say about any child. And one of my favorite examples is a teenage boy likes video games. I feel like we see in a lot of narratives. Well, that doesn't actually tell you much more about that young person. But maybe if there's a particular game that they've mastered, if he's loves to play Minecraft with his friends over the phone, then that's a detail that again takes it to that next level of interest. And so one of the things is, how do you get at this information if you don't necessarily know it? And the best way to do that is really to talk to the child or teen if they have the ability to participate in an interview. Maybe you talk to the foster parents if they don't, or other caregivers. But first and foremost, the goal is to engage youth. And it's easiest if that's done by somebody who knows the young person well, like a caseworker, a foster parent, another young person they know. We've seen some wonderful narratives come out of groups where teens will ask each other questions, and they may get at details with each other that they might not with someone else. So again, if you're going to do an interview of a child or teen, first of all, if you know the child, you're going to know what their triggers are. You want to be careful of those. For example, if they've been separated from their siblings, you might want to avoid a question about what do you do with your brothers and sisters, or you have to ask it carefully. So first and foremost, you have to work with somebody who knows the child if you are not somebody who knows the child yourself. And you also need to take time to get to know them. So if you are a recruiter coming to meet with a child early on, you can't just sit down and say, what do you like to do? What's important to you? You want to hang out with them. You can learn a lot by observing. So it's not just about asking questions. If the child has been in a family for a little while and has their own things there, you might see which books are there. Do they have library books? Well, then you can talk about what it's like to go to the library. So first and foremost, pause, get to know the child, observe, and then you can get at some of these questions. And again, if a foster parent is willing to do this, you can have them ask these questions. But so these are some examples of questions you might ask. What's your favorite thing to do outdoors? What do you like to do in your free time? What type of movies do you like? So again, what you're getting at is not just do you like movies, it's what type. Did the child just see Black Panther and think it's the best thing that's ever happened? Put that in the narrative, because I can tell you there are a lot of us out there who would really react to that right now. It's a wonderful thing to make a connection on. Because our whole goal here is to make connections with people who would say, you know what, I love that too. That's my favorite book. Anne of Green Gables changed my life as a teenager, and this child loves that too. So here's some other questions. Again, there are some here that I really like. If you had 3 wishes, what would they be? What makes you laugh? Who makes you laugh? Again, getting at some of the people who are important to them in their life is a wonderful thing to put into a narrative. It shows them being connected to families and to community and to neighbors. Again, if they like music, what kind? And do they play an instrument? Do they sing? Do they listen? So asking these questions and listening and getting to know them to find those details that really play into making the strengths-based narrative we've talked about. This is really the heart of making a compelling profile of a waiting child. Here's some other things. What are you really good at? What are you most proud of? What do you want to be when you grow up? What are some things you might like to do with a family? Again, you're giving people then a visual of the future of the child in a family and with a family perhaps like yours. Let's talk a little bit about what we think shouldn't be in a public narrative. And I think, first and foremost, we don't think anything should be in a public narrative that a child might be embarrassed by, that is private information, medical information, educational information without challenges. Those are things that aren't things that we would normally share publicly about ourselves and shouldn't share about children. We think obviously identifying information, no last names, no date of birth. No, be careful about school. We have sometimes if kids are involved in schools or they have a picture wearing a jersey, you got to watch out for that. We don't think the public profile should ever have information about their abuse, neglect, maltreatment, or their birth family, or placement information, if they've had 5 moves, how long they've been in care. Those are all things that are pretty personal and also may give somebody an impression of a child that isn't about them. They may think, oh, well, nobody's wanted this child for 10 years, and that might not be true. And again, anything that's going to make a family say, no, I'm not interested. This is the point where you want to interest families and get them thinking about the child as a person first, not as an entity in foster care who's been moving around or been moved from place to place. Again, I think there's no place for fears or anxieties, painful or embarrassing information, nothing about hygiene or bodily functions. That just doesn't belong in a public narrative. I talked a little bit about medical information, but again, we believe that the principles of HIPAA to protect private medical information means this information shouldn't be shared publicly on the internet about children who are waiting for a family. So we need to respect every person's right to their own private medical information, even if it's a child who doesn't cognitively understand what is being said about them. It's still private information. Somebody's ability to understand it doesn't change what we think their rights are to privacy. Same thing with educational challenges or intellectual ability. We think, again, the FERPA law I mentioned earlier, the philosophy, the principles behind that are that we all have a right to protect our educational information from disclosure, and that this is important to embrace that in these public narratives. One of the things I want to highlight here is the items about limiting potential families. It's in a narrative. It sometimes is easy to accidentally cross out a lot of families, saying this child should be in a 2-parent family, they should be in an urban area, they should, um, they must go to church regularly. Well, that isn't necessarily true. If the child wants to go to church, what you need is a family who will help make sure that child gets to church, even if the family goes sometimes with them, but other times maybe runs an errand, or they find a friend or a relative who's willing to go to that same faith community. So again, it doesn't have to. You can honor what is right for the child without limiting families in the public narrative. And there are issues of fit with family and family needs that you can address later with families who have a home study and are really seriously considering a particular child. And I'll talk a little bit about sexual orientation or gender identity. I have it on the red light item here in sexual orientation, but we actually believe if a young person is old enough and is out in their community and understands the risks, that the narrative can say if they are gay, lesbian, bisexual. But we think gender identity is a different thing, given the current sort of state of animosity in some communities and some sectors related to transgender children. We believe that should not be disclosed in a public narrative. We believe that the narrative should identify the child as the child identifies by name and gender. And one of the things you want to look for is make sure if something has changed since the child was first photo listed, that you are listing them, that all of the pronouns match and the names match, and there's no disconnect there. And again, I want to say, I'll say it a few more times because it's a drumbeat. I firmly believe in this, that this is never about keeping information for people who are going to adopt. It's just where to share and when to share that information. And we think it comes a little bit later. Now I'll talk just a little bit about what we called our yellow light items. Those are items to consider carefully. And I'll think a little bit more about some of these. One of them, we talked a little bit about it's okay to include a general statement about long-term needs. We would say don't say long-term medical needs because, again, that's disclosing a medical condition of some sort. We could talk about that a child will need ongoing support. But again, here in the public narrative, we wouldn't get too specific about what it is. I want to say a little bit more about discussion of appearance because we saw this is really, even positive descriptions of appearance can sometimes come across a little strangely. And I would say, so we believe, of course, there should never be a negative discussion of appearance or nothing a child would be judged by, oh, your narrative says you're short, or a child might read it and say, oh, it says I'm heavy. That's what somebody's putting out there about me. We certainly don't think that should ever be there. Discussion of positive appearance can have a negative feel too, that there are times when you read a narrative where, her shining blue eyes and long lashes look out at you. It can feel a little bit overselling of a child, or that it feels like you want somebody to be interested in the child because of their looks, which we know nobody is trying to do, but it just has that feel sometimes. So we'd say even positive discussion of appearance needs some care. But there are times where discussion of appearance is useful, and I'll say this often about children who have more serious medical needs or cognitive needs. Maybe appearance is something you can talk about, his curly red hair, or he's wearing his favorite purple sweatsuit. There are things where appearance, where we know the narratives are harder to write, where appearance may be one of those things that you can include. And certainly we believe that talking about somebody having a great smile is always a wonderful thing to say if it's true about a child. Something else to consider carefully is their preference on types of families. Again, we want to honor a child who's had a serious conversation with somebody about what type of family they want, but you don't want to automatically limit families either. So again, if they say, I really want somebody who has horses, who lives on a farm and has horses, maybe you have a conversation, well, what if they are able to take you riding every week down at the barn, not far? Is it somebody who will respect your love of horses as opposed to somebody who has to have a horse? So again, that's just something to consider carefully and be thinking about whether you might be automatically turning some people away. Because our goal always with these public narratives is to see how many people we can interest in adoption and in this child to see if they're going to move forward. I already talked about sexual orientation. So again, we think that can be done carefully if the youth is engaged, involved, and well-informed. And another area to consider carefully is if a child is a parent. We don't believe that a pregnant teen should be listed, or somebody who's going to become a parent, because we think that's disclosing medical information. But if the young person is a parent and they have, again, are informed about it and want it in the narrative because it's certainly a core part of who they are, we think that's an okay thing to include in the narrative. So that is a summary of what we think should and shouldn't go in the public narrative. And Tracy, do you have some questions for me?
I do. Does it seem dishonest to only include positive information, in public narrative?
That's a good question, and I don't think so. I think, as you know, I talked about it earlier. Really, it's about putting your best foot forward, and it's what we all do. We're never suggesting making up information or putting in things that aren't true. We're just saying put in the things that are strengths-based, that are going to put the best foot forward. And I do want to say that we should always be sharing information about the effects of trauma, grief, and loss for children who've been in foster care, in general information about adoption. So if you have a website talking about adoption and talking about the characteristics of children who are in foster care, absolutely you want to include information about the impact of trauma, maybe higher incidence of physical and behavioral concerns. So talking generally about the needs of children in foster care and adoption is really important for people, even those at the early stages of considering it. But you don't need to link that to a particular child's profile each time. And again, to keep in mind that those families who are really already in the process or working toward the process, they're going to get that information when they need it, when they're at the right stage in the process.
Thank you. How can I write a strengths-based narrative for a child or youth with very high medical needs or cognitive challenges?
Yeah, this is one of the trickiest ones, and I wanted to start out by saying that it's harder. But I think it's still possible to be strengths-based even when there are many challenges. I think virtually all children have some things that they like or they respond to. And this is one where it really is going to come down to information from the caregiver or the foster parent about what the child reacts to. Again, this is one where you're not going to be able to go do an interview in most cases if we're talking about some of the most serious concerns. But I can tell you that every caregiver we've talked to who's raising a child with very high needs, they know what they like. They know when they react when a certain person comes in the room. There may be a smell that they react to, or when they go out in the car, they smile more, or they tap their hands when the windows are down, or they love to be wheeled into the park. They do react. They do have positive reactions to things. And again, I talked a little bit earlier about they can talk about a favorite toy. Is there a stuffed animal in their bed that they always have with them? Do you have a favorite SpongeBob t-shirt? There are positive things to say about every person if we look hard enough. And the other thing is talk about what they can do. So if a child, we say don't say that they're nonverbal or in a wheelchair, but if they can, you can say, oh, he points at his favorite items, or he smiles when a toy lights up. There are things to say. If someone uses sign language, you don't need to say she can't speak. You can say she uses sign language. So, and again, when you're talking about things, if they've made progress, you can talk about some of that. But I will say here to be a little bit careful. We've seen some narratives that feel like they're descriptions of a patient, not a child, where it's a list of their developmental milestones in a way that, like, he can point at 3 objects and she can blink when she wants something. And that's one where you just have to be careful to not write it as a list of things they are able to do, but rather as things, how they react to the world around them. And we do have on the AdoptUSKids website, we have some sample narratives of children with higher needs. And I would say that I'll talk a little bit more about what else to do to make a compelling narrative, but reading what others have done and really learning from others is a great thing to do in this area.
Thank you. And what's the best way to get more information about a child or a youth?
Well, again, I think talked a little bit about this earlier. I'd say the ideal, one of the things we'd really love to see is systemic changes where positive information on what they like to do, what they're good at, is collected as part of case files, so that even someone who didn't know the child well could learn about them and write a good profile from that. So we'd love to see that be part of a change down the road in what's collected in case files. Again, I think the best thing is talking to the people who know the child best. Um, foster parents can certainly help here, a recruiter, caseworkers, and depending on the age and developmental ability of the child, talk to the child, him or herself, and they they know what engages them. And if you take the time to get to know them and see what they respond to, that's where you're going to get the most information and the best information.
Thank you.
All right. Now, again, I'll talk a little bit more about I've talked about what's in or what's out, but here we'll talk a little bit about what makes a narrative really more interesting and more compelling. And I've talked a little bit about that, but I want to go a little deeper. Because again, you could have all strengths-based information, but if it's not presented well, it still might not be as engaging as you want it to be. Because again, our goal is to get people really interested. And first, I mean, so talking about details, quotes, and stories. It's, as I said earlier, you want to talk about, if he likes basketball. Okay, does he play? Is he a point guard? Has he got a great rebounding record, or does he like to watch it? If a child likes animals, what animals? Do they have any? Would they like to have any? So it's not saying she likes animals. It's horses are her favorite thing in the whole world, and she'd love to have a dog one day. She would train it and could even see herself as an animal trainer one day. So it's those details and the quotes. I'd say quotes are really important. I think if any of us read newspaper stories, it's when you hear the voices of the people most affected that we're really engaged. And I'd say, again, in engaging youth, what does the child or youth say? So if you ask the question about what their 3 wishes are, if it's a good answer, use their quote. We've certainly seen whole narratives written in the youth's voice, and when they've written their own, I think that's a wonderful thing. I do want to caution here that we've also seen narratives that use the youth's voice, but don't seem to be written by a child or a youth, where language just doesn't really feel like something a child says, and we certainly don't think you should do that. That you really want accurate quotes, you want positive quotes, and those are going to make things really interesting. And I would say that if you're quoting a young person, that's still not your opportunity to allow things in that wouldn't otherwise be in. So if you ask a child what her 3 wishes are, and one of them, I wish I did better at school and wasn't getting a D in math. Well, okay, skip that wish. Include 2 wishes then, not 3. Just because a young person says it, or the foster parent says it, or their caseworker says it, doesn't mean it needs to go in if it is not some of that strengths-based information we talked about earlier. But again, quotes can be from, there's some wonderful quotes from foster parents talking about what they like to do with the child. So if, her foster dad says she loves to help him when he's working on the car and has learned to change oil, that's a pretty compelling story. It shows an interest, it shows she's connected with another person, and it really makes you think about who she is as a person. And somebody who's interested in working on cars might go, oh, hey, this could be a fit for me. So it's those details, those stories. Again, a story about, he did a science project studying what time animals eat at different times of the year. You can have some really interesting stories that make you stop, think, and engage with the person. The other thing is, just positive adjectives. Again, we want them to be true, but somebody might be accomplished, engaging, outgoing, affectionate, entertaining, enthusiastic, funny, wonderful. Adjectives really help draw us in and make everything more interesting. A couple of things I want to talk about is, again, sentence structure and style. And again, for non-writers, I apologize, but it's really helpful when you're reading a narrative if the sentences aren't all Jane likes basketball, Jane's favorite food is hamburgers, Jane likes to sing. You really can mix up your sentences by this star basketball player loves LeBron James and the Cavaliers. When she's not playing sports, Amelia loves to eat fish and chips. So you can vary your sentence structure so it just makes it more interesting to read. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but this is where if you read other narratives and you see what you like, you see what sounds good to you, you can learn from what others have done. The other thing I'd say is within a group of narratives, be careful to vary the structure. We know that a lot of people have a template, so they might be what the child likes to do, how they're doing in school, what they want to be when they grow up. And there's nothing wrong with that. But if prospective parents are reading 10, 15, 20 narratives in a row, they sometimes can lose interest just because of that lack of variability. So it's good to have a template of information you'd like to have in there, but maybe you switch it up. So in one narrative, you talk about somebody who's studying science in school, and then the next paragraph you say they might want to be a doctor. Well, the other one, you could start with this future doctor loves science and does really well in school, and then can talk about other interests. So just think about that variability is really good when people are reading multiple narratives at a time. Next, I want to talk about photos, and we're not going to talk a tremendous amount about photos, but I can tell you that almost everyone we've talked to who does recruitment work says the photo is one of the most important elements, and that adding a new photo, updating it, is what generates new inquiries and new interest. That we all know that, a picture is worth 1,000 words, and really having a high quality, positive picture is going to make all the difference in engaging people. And we'd say, good quality means it's a high resolution image taken with a decent camera or phone. And again, most phones now take really good pictures if you're close enough and the lighting is good. And we'd say include a photo, even if you don't have the best photo, it's okay to include it, but update it as quickly as you can. One of the things we want the photos to be careful not to have a school in the background, a street sign in the background, any other private information I mentioned earlier. If they have a jersey for a school sport, you probably want to have them change that, or maybe Photoshop out any names that might be in it so that it doesn't reveal where they are. Again, we want to think about what kids are wearing for the photos, that they don't have a T-shirt with a gun on it, or they're not wearing something that's more revealing, the pants are sliding down. You want, photos of kids, if you can, with something that's important to them. If they have a stuffed toy or a kid with a basketball, some of those pictures, again, where it paints a picture of a child engaged in their world and interested in what they're doing. And I'll just say a little bit about geotagging. And this is something, again, for example, on the AdoptUSKids photo listing system, we remove geotags. You just want to make sure if you're doing online listing, whether it's websites or anything else, that any images don't have geotags, which is location information that could tell somebody where a child is or was. So again, it's something you want to know about for your own system to make sure that any geotags are removed, particularly if you're having pictures taken with cell phones, but a lot of cameras now have geotags as well. So that's just something to be aware of. And we have information here about how to remove them. It's a little bit different on a Windows computer than a Mac, but it's basically getting at the properties or the information about the photo and choosing to remove the personal information. And on a Mac, again, you use the preview app and tools to remove the geographic information. So again, just something to be aware of for photo safety. We certainly know we know that children in foster care are vulnerable to predation, and having anything that gives their location just isn't the best thing for them, of course. Now I want to talk a little bit about, that was all on the public narrative side and what's available to everyone. Now I want to talk a little bit about what's in a private profile. And I want to make it clear that it doesn't have to be, the AdoptUSKids photo listing actually has something called a private narrative. But even if you don't have that within your photo listing, you can have a private narrative. It could be a document that you share with families. It could be a conversation, it could be email. It's any avenue for sharing more details about a child with people who have moved farther along in the process. And so when we're talking about a private profile, we're talking about information that's shared with people who have approved home study and who have signed a confidentiality agreement. So they are on board with understanding that they're going to get more confidential information about a child that they're interested in. And what we've seen is that the confidentiality agreement, we've talked to some places that do that, and they said it's actually a really great step for prospective parents. They see prospective parents then feel like, oh, I'm already protecting this child. I am working with the system, working with this agency to protect this child. And so it's a really nice step to help them, think about their role in protecting a child who's already experienced trauma and loss in their life. And so as I said, in the AdoptUSKids photo listing, we have people have to be registered and home studied to access this private information. But depending on how your system does it, you could share it anyway as long as you know you're sharing it with people who have that home study. And you'll see this is how it looks on the AdoptUSKids system. If you are entering a narrative, you'll see at the top it says public narrative. That's where you'd enter anything you want the entire public to see. And then there's private information, which is it tells you for home study families. So this is just if you're entering information on AdoptUSKids, you can see the different categories. And again, if you have a system that works like this, great. If you don't, you can still have a private narrative even without an application that does it. So I want to talk about, so what goes in a private profile, a private narrative? And this is still a place where we don't think everything goes in. And so you want to think about what to consider here. And the first and foremost, is there information here that's going to help parents know what this child's needs are so that they can consider whether they may be able to meet them, so that they can learn more. Again, this is not, you're not doing a matching process from a private narrative, but it is helping parents know if they can step forward and do more. You still want the information to be strengths-based, so it needs to be presented respectfully in a way that protects the child. Is a written form the right place to share the information? Is it clear and concise? And again, we'd say we've certainly seen many, both public and private narratives that have a lot of acronyms, diagnoses, and many things that aren't that meaningful to many prospective parents. And so if you are going to present medical information, present it in layperson's terms, so it's as clear as possible. So here we'll talk about what to include. First and foremost, we'd say functioning or disability level. Many photo listings have this, where they'll talk about how a child is functioning at a behavioral level, what their medical needs are, what their cognitive needs are, and those might range from no challenges to mild to serious to severe. So again, if you have those levels, you want to define them for people so that if you say someone has mild medical needs, explain what that is. Does that mean they might have a periodic doctor's appointment? They may have some allergies. So again, those levels are often really helpful. And again, they help parents who have often thought about, well, I can handle someone with a serious medical issue, but I'm not as good if they have a really severe behavioral challenge. So again, those levels kind of help people think about their own ability to meet a child's needs, which is what, of course, it's all about once we're talking about home study families. This is, again, where you would put in information that we think this is where you can share medical information. So you might have a diagnosis, what types of care they may be receiving very generally. Again, this isn't, you don't want it to be your medical file or your case file. There's time for that in the next stage, but you really want people to understand. So if someone has a particular diagnosis, will they have to continue to see a doctor regularly for the next, every month for the next few years? You want, here we can list specific disabilities related to school, education, or intellectual ability. You can talk about if someone's in special education or individual education plan. So letting folks know that, and again, it's really good to still keep it strengths-based. So if they have made great progress, we'll put that in here. This is still a place to highlight what works and what the child is doing well. If they've had behavioral challenges, are those improving, and what has helped them improve? I think it's really important to talk about their support needs. And so if we know this is a child who's going to need tutoring in school, or this is a child who can have continued counseling, those are things that you can include here in the private narrative. Other things to include, this is the top one here, is one of the ones I think is most important, is what are you looking for from the family? What is the family, does the family need particular skills in medical care, in do they need to have particular time to devote to a therapy appointment, building nurturing relationships? Do you need somebody who has, great sense of humor? What are the things about the family that's going to help them match with this child? Again, here's where we would talk about what the child's expressed desire. So if the child has said they want a particular type of family, let's put it here. Again, it doesn't mean that you want to rule everybody out. You have to be, again, careful here if it's related to race or ethnic background, that you're not violating the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act. But again, this is where we're talking about families who are getting more serious. So see what they have the right to know what the child is interested in. As we mentioned earlier, whether the child is lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender, if the child wants it in the private narrative, this is a good place for it. And we've also talked about adoption assistance eligibility and whether they're legally free. And I didn't mention those earlier, but we think those are both things not to put in the public narrative, partly because, again, legally free or not may dissuade some people early on. It also is confusing information for some people and for peers, like, wait, you're free versus costing money. And again, with adoption assistance, again, that's pretty personal information, thinking about whether if a child looks at, oh, someone might need assistance to adopt me. But the private narrative is certainly the place to include that information. And then I don't have a slide on it, but one of the things I want to say here is that we still don't think the private profile is a place to say everything. There are certain things that we think have enough stigma or require more of a conversation. So I think sexual victimization or acting out, things that are like a child who is cutting. We don't think it's the place for placement information or birth parent history. Those are things critically important to be shared. But really at that next stage, when a family is really getting all of the details, we do think that, so the private narrative, there are some things that, because again, it's still a document that could be shared with others, even if they have a confidentiality agreement. So there are some things that we think can wait for that next stage for a conversation, but you can talk a little bit about them here and say there's more information to be learned. All right. And again, this is back to, I just want to refer back to that continuum diagram I showed earlier, that there's a place for every disclosure of information, and we want to disclose it all, but the private narrative isn't quite everything yet. It's just a lot of information to help parents decide if they can and want to learn more. Tracy, do you have any questions for me?
I do. Mary, do you have recommendations or tips for how to implement this approach if we don't have a private narrative option in our system?
Sure. I think, again, there are many easy ways. So if you have, that families have a home study. So again, if you're with an agency working with the families, you'll know they have a home study. Otherwise, you could ask to see a copy of their home study. You could then, you can mail them a written document. You could, do a confidentiality agreement by email, and then you could mail them a written document or email. You can also do it through a conversation, and we certainly know some jurisdictions that do that, where they have a conversation already at this second level. So there's no reason it can't be shared almost any other way. It doesn't have to be an online photo listing. And if you have it developed, it doesn't even have to be a tremendous amount of work to, oh, we've got the agreement, they're ready, here we can shoot this email or mail off to them with the information. And one of the things that we recommend is sharing the public and private narratives together. So again, continuing to see the child as a full person and their strengths and positive nature first, and with their challenges. So we think share both of those things together when you do send them to someone.
Thank you. You also mentioned just now that there are certain behaviors like cutting or sexual acting out that are very stigmatized and shouldn't be included in the private narrative, in the private profile. How do you recommend approaching this in terms of the private profile so that it's not left out entirely?
Yeah, great question. I think there are two ways that we recommend dealing with that. One is you are going to have filled out those functioning levels. So if a child has very serious behaviors, you're going to show that in the functioning level. And if you have done your descriptions of those levels, some of that type of behavior may be listed there. The other thing is we'd really recommend putting in the narrative saying this child has serious behaviors and we will discuss them with any parents interested in learning more information. So letting them know that there is more information they need to know goes along with this serious behavior issue. So they're gonna know they need to ask more. But so rather than putting it in writing someplace where it could be shared further, you can do it that way. So you let them know there's something to follow up on. And again, if you're doing the private narrative by conversation, again, you could have that conversation with families who are really interested and are just focused on this particular child.
Well, that leads into my next question of when do you recommend that we do the full disclosure?
Sure, and I think that it's going to vary a little bit based on what your system is like, but it's when a parent is interested in inquiring about one particular child or sibling group. They're like, this is the one that I really want to move forward with. Everything I've read so far, everything I know in the private narrative fits with I can handle this, I am ready for this, and it's when they've said that. So this is the one that they want to learn more. So you wouldn't share more if they're like, hey, I want to know about these 5 more. You want them to really be thinking seriously about this particular child or sibling group. And that's the place where you say, okay, then let's sit down and we're going to have a conversation. Again, it could be worker to worker, worker to parent, just depending on how your system operates. But we're going to have this discussion about, here are more details, here's what you need to know. And again, we would say, and here are the supports we can provide to you to meet this child's needs, so that the conversation is both about what the child's needs are and what their history is, but also about what you can do to help meet those needs and help ensure the parents are able to move forward.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Now we'll just talk a little bit about what we think everyone can do to, I hope that you're now thinking, oh, I really want to do this. I want to do this for kids. I want to make a difference. I want to embrace what we've been talking about here today. So we'll give you some specific tips and strategies to do that, depending on what your position is. And first, we'll talk a little bit about administrators, because I think many things. This can come from the top, or it can come from a groundswell from the bottom. But either way, it's great if we can get administrators to embrace strengths-based public recruitment. And I think the first and foremost, what we want administrators to do is to believe that this is the right way to do our practice and to embrace guidance like this. And as I said, I didn't say it earlier, we do have guidance on this for administrators and for workers on the AdoptUSKids website. Just go to AdoptUSKids.org. You can find that. And we have checklists, we have information, so administrators could just say, yep, we are doing this. We are going to embrace this paradigm shift, and this is what can be included in our narratives, and this is what can't. And they can, whether you take the AdoptUSKids guidance, you can adapt it to your own system. But I think first and foremost, making a public statement to the professionals in your field saying, yep, this is the way we're going to do business. We're going to be best foot forward. This is the way we operate. But then something else they can do is look at, see where they're at right now. So again, an administrator might not be that closely involved with photolisting or public recruitment. So start reading the narratives in your state. Go on AdoptUSKids or your state photolisting or your Wednesday Child features. How are you doing now? You may be doing an amazing job and be very strengths-based, but you may have some areas where you'd like to change it. So I think that's the other thing, is to assess how your system is doing right now. And if there are some changes you need to make, there's a process here. You want to create a process for sharing private information. So if you're changing what's shared publicly, you want to make sure you have an avenue for sharing more information when families have been through a home study, so they can get that information at the right stage. So that's an important step in the process for administrators. One thing is to think about staffing changes, and that might be both for gathering information for narratives, for writing narratives, but also for responding to inquiries. We don't want to ignore that if you have more strengths-based narratives, you may get more inquiries, which again is the ultimate goal. We talk to administrators and some communities, and they're like, bring it on. We want those inquiries because those are all people who are interested in adopting and maybe will move forward with adoption. So, but you might, as an administrator, you might need to say, okay, we might have to have a couple more people handle inquiries, or we spread that out over a different area so that we can handle any new inquiries that come in. And again, you can develop a process for inquiries. So if it's somebody from the public, you'd say, thanks so much for your inquiry. You know, you can get more information when on a child when you've had a home study, but right now we have orientation in these places and then training, and here's how you move forward. So engaging people, responding positively, but until they have a home study, you don't need to share more information about a particular child. And then staffing related to the narratives is if you have a communications person or caseworker who's a great writer, maybe that person does editing for everyone and helps out. And there could be some shifting around of responsibilities if there's somebody who has that talent and that ability. One of the things to do is to implement training for existing staff and for new staff who are engaged in photo listing. So first of all, training on the guidance itself, on what can go in and what can't, but also on how to do a better job with narratives and how to, tips for writing and strategies. That it's not something that people are necessarily going to know, but we know that training can make a difference. The other thing to do is to communicate clearly with prospective parents. So if you have an online photo listing, maybe you say there, we disclose information at different stages in the process. Here's what we provide publicly, and then here's what we provide with people who have a home study. Really good to let people know what they're going to learn when. It really makes people feel more comfortable if they know, okay, I can learn that when I'm at the next stage in the process. Other things administrators want to do is have a review process. So is there somebody who's going to review narratives to see if there are items in there that shouldn't be? And then again, maybe you need a quality assurance. So if you're starting to see a bunch of narratives that have information and it's new staff, you're like, oh, maybe we didn't do that training of new staff. So just having an internal review process before things go public, figuring out if there are places where you're not meeting your own guidance. Another thing that's really important is creating scheduled reviews to keep narratives and photos updated. I can't tell you how painful it can be to read a description of a child with a photo of a 16-year-old and a birth date showing a 16-year-old, and the description is talking about them in second grade. It does two things. One is shows it could imply that there's a cognitive delay, a very serious one. It could show that nobody's paying attention to this child and nobody's helping to make sure they get adopted. And so those regular updates are really important, both because we change and we want it to be accurate about the child, because it shows this commitment to doing the best we can for children. And again, we wouldn't talk too much about photos, but the world has really come around to that the photographs make a difference, and there are many, many professional photographers who are willing to work with systems and do wonderful photos of children waiting to be adopted. And that's a great way to engage families and really have people stop and take a second look and learn more. Next, I'll talk a little bit about what workers or recruiters can do, those who are actually crafting the narrative. I think the first and foremost is copy what works. First of all, you got to look at what other narratives, look at what people are doing. See which ones mean something to you, and then spend time identifying why is it good. Is it the details? Is it great writing? Is it a combination? And then copy. I don't mean the content, but copy. We can all learn. You can copy the structure that other people use. You can copy the ideas. There are people who, wonderful ones that show like, this child is a superhero. There can be little things like that you work into your narrative so we can really learn from others. And I think another great thing is to partner with others for reviewing. Even if you don't have a formal review process in your agency, you can review each other's work. And I'd say as you review these over time, which I've looked at a lot of these, there are things that you keep an eye out for, and you guys can even make a checklist of things that you want to keep an eye out. I'd say that there's code language for things like he's very energetic, she does fairly well in school, staff help her with X. Well, that just shows that she's in the, not in a family. Shows a placement information. There are some keywords like the word but often signals that something negative is being slipped in. So there are things like that that as you partner with each other for review, you will catch those. Another word is seems. He seems to be very friendly. Well, no, just he's friendly. The other thing is if you read a bunch of narratives and share with one another, you'll see the things that get repeated a lot, and you can learn to delete them from your narrative. And one of my best examples, I already mentioned video games, but we often see she's slow to warm up, but is friendly once she gets to know you. Well, you don't need to say that. There's not really value in saying that. That's just a child who's friendly. There's nothing wrong with being slow to warm up, but there also isn't value in it, and especially if you see it in dozens of narratives at a time. I think, again, we talked about this earlier, key things you can do is they're engaging youth in making quotes, talking about what they want to include, reviewing the narrative to see what they think of it, asking those interview questions, observing them, having the youth involved in at their own ability level is a wonderful thing to do to make a narrative more positive and more engaging. The other thing is foster parents are a great resource. They maybe teachers, there are others, it could even be a therapist. Again, you wouldn't want to talk about it as a therapist, but anybody who's had even doctors, nurses, people who've had long time connections with a child, again, don't disclose those roles, but you could still have quotes about what a joy it is to see this child, or this is what the child reacts to. So engaging others who are connected to the child and care about the child is a great way to get information. Other things that workers can do is helping prospective parents understand it. If this is a shift for your system, you want to make it clear in written documents or just in phone conversations. So if somebody makes an inquiry and they want to know more about a child, say, we are dedicated to protecting children. That's what we're all about. So we will share that information with you once you're at the next stage in the process. So helping them understand that they have a role in partnering to protect children as well is really important. Other things, I mentioned foster parents. I have it on here twice. I think it's so important, apparently. But I think there are other ways. Foster parents can give you quotes. They can take photos. You can ask them to review the narrative to see if anything's changed periodically. You can make them, foster parents are here because they care about kids and they know their role is to protect kids and say, hey, we need your help. Can you help us? Let us know if there's anything in here that you don't think should be in here or that isn't protective of this child. So that's a great thing that workers can do, is help foster parents be partners in this effort as well. I want to talk a little bit about a new feature in the AdoptUSKids photo listing application, and we think it's going to be a great resource for folks who are interested in doing better, but may not have thought about this as much as we have, because we've thought about it a lot and talked about it a lot as a project. And when you're entering the public narrative on AdoptUSKids, it talks about what you're supposed to include: talent, skills, interests, aspirations. You'll see that it mentions here that it's seen by everyone, including the child. And there's a link to learning more about the guidance I mentioned earlier. But the thing that we're really excited about is something called Check My Narrative. And you'll see that if you click that, it will provide, it'll search for certain keywords. And those keywords include, it's based on the reviews that we've done of these thousands and thousands of narratives, on what the things were that we thought shouldn't go in. So it looks for medical information, it looks for medication, it looks for things related to grades in school, it looks for words like aggressive, it looks for any of the things that we have found over time might signal something that shouldn't be in a public narrative. And what this does is it will check the narrative for you, and then it comes back with highlighted text of anything that might be a concern. And it suggests revising the public narrative, and it talks about you could move it to the optional private or confidential section. Again, there sometimes can be false positives come up here, but most of the times it's going to pull up the things that we don't think should be in here. So we're really excited about this as an opportunity to help people learn to do better. When again, it's not something you've been thinking about. We know that most people doing this work are doing it among many, many other things. And so we wanted this as a tool to help people do better without getting as deep into it as we have on the AdoptUSKids. So I'm going to close with that. Oh, and it'll just, if you don't find anything, it'll tell you that you did just fine. And I'm going to close with that. And Tracy, if you have more questions.
You mentioned that this approach to writing public narratives could possibly generate more inquiries. Is there anything else we should be thinking about or know in terms of preparing for that?
Yeah, I think it's a really good
possibility.
Question. Yeah, I think it is something to be thinking about. And I said there are a couple of things you can do. One is you want to come up with what you're going to say to, those who have a home study versus those who don't. So for people who don't have a home study, you want to be welcoming as can be. You want to share information about the characteristics of children in care and strengths that families need to have, and you want to get them engaged in your process. And so you want to have somebody who can do that. And there's, that might be your staff. You might have foster adoptive parent volunteers who can share more information. You might connect them with agencies in the community. So you definitely want to know, you need to have the information available and have thought about who's going to respond to this. I think first and foremost, the key is, to embrace it as, hey, if we get more inquiries, we are likely to have more prospective parents in here, and that's really good for kids, and that's what we're all about. The other thing is to have ready how you'll respond to families who do have a home study. So you already have the detailed information you're going to share with them. You have a way to check that they have a home study and get a confidentiality agreement. But we did develop a guide for administrators to think about, and we know this response system matters tremendously. So that guide has a great resource on thinking about the response system and the questions you want to ask. So you do want to be thinking about that as you're moving to a strengths-based system for sure.
Thank you. And if my work doesn't involve photo listing, is there a way that what you're saying here in this webinar applies to other types of work with resource families?
Absolutely. And I think this gets to what we were talking about earlier, that if you ignored everything I said and just thought about strengths-based, 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 then you could do anything. So whether you're talking about you're looking for a family for a child in foster care, so you're not looking for an adoptive family, if you're still thinking best foot forward, strengths-based first, you want to talk to that foster family, that prospective foster family, about who the child is as a child, what they like to do, what's important to them. And you always start with that. I just think that can be any part of all of our work, is to embrace their strengths first. And then when you're moving along, you share information in the process. And so I would say no matter what you're doing, if you just think about that philosophy of how would I want to be treated, how would I want children in my life to be talked about and treated publicly and with others, that can cross over any type of work that you're doing. Again, same thing on the family side. If you're a worker who is supporting foster parents or adoptive parents, and helping them remember their strengths, helping them rely on their strengths, and you focusing on what they do well, even if you're helping them with a challenge, is just going to make everything more successful. So I think that philosophy carries over regardless of how you're working with children, teens, and families.
Thank you.
Thank you. And again, I really appreciate the questions too. Here, I mentioned them earlier, but here are some of the resources that we have on the AdoptUSKids website, the narratives. The first is a detailed guide on creating effective narratives. It's really targeted for those who are working on narratives or gathering information for narratives. It also has information that's useful to leaders and managers so they can work with staff. We have it's the comprehensive narrative writing checklist. That just talks about what I called earlier, the green light, yellow light, red light items. It's a quick checklist that you can use as you're creating narratives or reviewing them, saying, oops, that really shouldn't be in there. I got to move that to the private narrative. And then also we have information online on writing children's narratives, which has some of this other information, but it also has tips and strategies for some of the writing aspect of it and just things to look out for and examples. We also have sample narratives that we think are particularly good. And as I said, I think that is a key piece of this, is seeing what others have done and seeing the ones that you think really are meaningful is a great way to start and get those in your head. Like, oh yeah, this can be really good. So those are some resources for you. And here is contact information for me and for Tracy. It's really important for everyone to know that we at AdoptUSKids are here to help, particularly the capacity building and engagement team that Tracy directs is part of our role is to provide guidance, resources, and information for you. And we would love to help anyone who's embarking on this work. And that is the end of our webinar. Again, I really appreciate your time and hope you have a great day. Thank you so much.